All right, let's talk about America's founding fathers. You know, the powdered wig crew on dollar bills? Yeah, those guys. We've been taught to think of them as these flawless, freedom-loving heroes who magically birthed a nation. But what if I told you that behind those perfectly posed portraits and carefully crafted speeches, there's a much more complicated and frankly darker story? These guys weren't just writing declarations and sipping tea. They were wrestling with some seriously heavy contradictions, and their choices still echo through American history today. We're diving headfirst into the messed up, often overlooked parts of their lives, the stuff they don't print in textbooks. Okay, let's talk about George Washington, the general who led the Continental Army to victory, the dude on the $1 bill, the first president of the United States. We all know the legend, brave, stoic, maybe chopped down a cherry tree or two. Spoiler alert, he totally didn't. But here's the thing about legends. They're often polished to obscure the more complicated truth. And the truth about George Washington is that he was deeply entangled with slavery. Washington was one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia. He inherited his first enslaved person at 11, and by his death, over 300 people were enslaved at Mount Vernon. He actively pursued those who sought freedom, like Ona Judge. Did Washington just let her go? Nope. He used his political connections to try and force her return. Washington knew slavery was a moral stain on the nation, but he stayed largely silent, prioritizing unity over dismantling the system. So, was Washington a hero? A villain? The answer is more complicated than a simple label. Understanding his deep hypocrisy is crucial to understanding American history. Let's talk about Thomas Jefferson, the guy who penned the immortal words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Powerful stuff, right? Inspiring even. Except when you consider that Jefferson himself owned over 600 human beings throughout his lifetime, those words start to ring a little hollow. See, Jefferson wasn't just some detached philosopher king pondering lofty ideals. He was a wealthy plantation owner who inherited his first enslaved people at the age of 21. He built his wealth, his lifestyle, on the backs of forced labor, and it wasn't just about work. Jefferson profited off the children born into slavery, using them as collateral for loans, treating human lives as financial assets. And then there's Sally Hemings. You might have heard whispers about this one. Hemings was one of Jefferson's enslaved workers, a young woman who bore him at least 6 children. Now, some argue for a love story, but let's be real. A powerful white man, a teenager enslaved on his property. There's no escaping the power imbalance, the inherent coercion woven into that relationship. So why do we gloss over this? Why is Jefferson still celebrated as a champion of liberty? It's complicated. Some argue he was a product of his time, that he opposed slavery in theory but couldn't break free from the system he was embedded in. But here's the thing. Jefferson's contradictions, his hypocrisy, are not just footnotes in history. They are central to understanding how a nation founded on ideals of equality could simultaneously enshrine the brutal institution of slavery in its constitution. And that, my friends, is a conversation we're still having today. Chapter 3. Benjamin Franklin, Inventor, Diplomat, and Rebranded Rebel. Benjamin Franklin, founding father, inventor, diplomat, the guy who flew a kite in a thunderstorm, which, by the way, probably didn't happen exactly like the storybooks tell it. He's often remembered for his wit, his charm, his contributions to science and literature, but even good old Ben wasn't immune to the moral complexities of his time. Early in his life, Franklin was involved in the slave trade. Not directly buying and selling people, but he did print advertisements for runaway slaves in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He even owned a few enslaved individuals himself. Now, to be fair, Franklin later became an abolitionist, even petitioning Congress to end slavery. But that shift in thinking happened after decades of benefiting from the system. And it wasn't just slavery where Franklin's actions contradicted his later ideals. He also played a role in shaping negative perceptions of Native Americans, portraying them as savages to justify colonial expansion. Remember that whole Join or Die cartoon with the segmented snake? That was Franklin, using fear and prejudice to rally the colonies against a supposed Indian threat. So what do we do with this more complicated picture of Franklin? Do we dismiss him as just another hypocrite in a powdered wig? Or do we acknowledge that even brilliant minds can be shaped by the prejudices of their time, and that true progress often involves confronting our own past mistakes? Franklin's story reminds us that history is not a neat and tidy narrative. It's messy, full of contradictions, and understanding those contradictions is key to understanding the complexities of the world we live in today. Chapter 4. Alexander Hamilton, not the musical version. Alright, let's talk about Alexander Hamilton. Thanks to a certain hit musical, he's gone from a relatively obscure founding father to a full-blown cultural phenomenon. But while the musical paints him as a staunch abolitionist, the reality is, well, a lot more complicated. See, Hamilton married into the Schuyler family, one of the wealthiest families in New York, and guess how they made their fortune? You got it, slavery. While Hamilton personally expressed some reservations about slavery, he also participated in the institution, buying and selling enslaved people on behalf of his in-laws. He even defended the property rights of slaveholders, arguing that taking away their property without compensation would be unjust. And it wasn't just slavery where Hamilton's actions diverged from his more idealistic rhetoric. He was a staunch advocate for a strong central government, for a national bank, for policies that benefited the wealthy elite. Now, you could argue, he was just trying to create a stable financial system for the fledgling nation. But his vision of America was one where power was concentrated in the hands of the few, not the many. So, was Hamilton a villain? Not necessarily. He was a complex figure with a deep intellect and a driving ambition to shape the future of the nation. But his story, much like the stories of the other founding fathers, reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry woven from countless threads, some bright, some dark, and understanding the full picture requires acknowledging both. Chapter 5. The Constitution, Freedom for the Few. The Constitution, the bedrock of American democracy, the document that enshrines freedom and equality for all. Except when it was written, all didn't really mean everyone, did it? The Founding Fathers, for all their talk of liberty, created a system that protected their own power and privilege while systematically excluding large segments of the population. Let's start with the most glaring omission: slavery. The Constitution, in its original form, didn't just allow for slavery, it protected it. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Clause, these weren't just oversights, they were deliberate compromises made to appease Southern slaveholders and ensure the ratification of the Constitution. And it wasn't just enslaved people who were left out. Women were entirely absent from the Constitution, denied basic rights like voting and property ownership. Indigenous people, despite being here for millennia before European arrival, were treated as foreign entities, their sovereignty ignored, their land routinely seized. The truth is, the Founding Fathers weren't crafting a utopia for all. They were building a nation that served their interests, a nation where power was concentrated in the hands of white, land-owning men like themselves. And while the Constitution has been amended and reinterpreted over the years, the legacy of that original exclusion is still felt today. Understanding the limitations of the Constitution, the ways in which it both enshrined and perpetuated inequality, is crucial to understanding the ongoing struggle for social justice in America. It's a reminder that freedom, equality, these aren't static concepts, they're ongoing projects, and it's up to each generation to continue the fight for a more just and equitable society. The story doesn't end here. So we've just scratched the surface of the Founding Fathers and their complicated legacies. We've seen their flaws, their contradictions, the ways in which their actions often diverged from their lofty ideals. But here's the thing. History isn't about judging the past by the standards of the present. It's about understanding how those past choices, those compromises, those hypocrisies, continue to shape the world we live in today. What if I told you that some of the Founding Fathers engaged in political maneuvers that would make even Frank Underwood blush? Or that secret societies, shrouded in mystery, might have played a role in shaping early American policies? The truth is often stranger and more fascinating than fiction. If you want to delve deeper into the messy, complicated, and often uncomfortable truths of American history, the kind of stuff they don't teach you in school, but that helps explain how we got to where we are today, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more stories to uncover, a lot more myths to debunk, and together we can start to grapple with the full complexity of the American story.